What's up, BookTube? Sandy Golson back here with my February 2021 reading wrap-up. I had a nice month of reading in the month of February. Didn't get to everything that I wanted to get to, but I got to quite a bit that I feel pretty good about, including a nice mix of fiction, nonfiction, as well as some books that help me with my research for writing and more. All of that coming up next. Okay, so I read a total of 7 books in the month of February, and the one I'm going to start with first is Real Life by Brandon Taylor. Now, this is a book that I had been thinking about reading for a while, and it has to do with being a black man in a predominantly white environment, dealing with microaggressions, and also there's an LGBTQ plus angle to the story as well. And so it was a book that I did enjoy reading. I was happy that I got a chance to read it. It was a little bit long in some ways, but that was part of the issue with maybe the length of it, was that in some places it was kind of overly descriptive and kind of made me start skimming at times, and I don't like skimming when I'm really interested in the subject matter, which I was in this particular book. But that didn't really take away as much from it as maybe it normally would have for me with books, because I was really interested in the content of this particular book. So it was a relatively quick read, even with the maybe overly descriptive sections of the book. And so I did enjoy reading it. It was a good book in the sense that you think of the racial aspects of it and dealing with the racial issues that a lot of people of color have to deal with, and then you got the LGBTQ plus part on top of that, and so that added another layer. So it had multiple layers of depth on it that I found really interesting in this particular book. So it was a really good read. I was excited about it, and I think if you find those subject matters pretty interesting and the intersection of those subject matters, I would definitely suggest you pick up Real Life by Brandon Taylor. Next up was The Black Friend by Frederick Joseph. It is The Black Friend on being a better white person. So, as you can tell by that subtitle to the title, it's probably not me that's the intended audience for this. However, I found it to be an interesting read in the sense that it did give me a little bit of insight to look at parts of the book and say, yeah, I can relate to that particular experience. I've had that type of experience in my life, and maybe I could have dealt with it a little bit better, or maybe I could have offered advice in terms of dealing with it a little bit better to another individual. So I was glad for that reason that I picked this up. One of the cool things about this book is that it has interviews within the book. And so, for example, and I talked about this in my weekly wrap-up after I finished this book, it has interviews with, for example, Angie Thomas, who wrote The Hate U Give, and who also just recently released Concrete Rose, which is a prequel to The Hate U Give. It has an interview with Jamel Hill as well, and a bunch of other people who are interviewed as part of this book. This book also has, in the back, it has a section, People and Things to Know. It also has a glossary in the back of racial terms that the author finds really important. And sprinkled throughout the book, there are little portions that add a certain context to things that you're reading. So it's kind of like a lesson within the book that really adds, I think, layers of depth to this book, and it really makes it kind of an educational type book. In a way, it's almost like a textbook, but not as dense and uncomfortable and academic to read with no disrespect intended. This is a really solid book, and definitely would recommend this book if you're interested in this subject matter. Next up, I read Triple Axe by Scott Cole, and the reason that I picked this up is it was a recommendation from a booktuber that specializes in horror stories, and this booktuber recommended this one. It was a relatively short book, basically a novella. Maybe you could debate whether it's a novella or just a kind of a full-length novel, but just on the shorter end. But that's neither here nor there. It's not really super important. But one of the main reasons I read this book is because I'm actually writing a horror story right now. So that's the author tube side of me and what I'm doing. So as I was reading this book, I was trying to look for things that I could take away in terms of how to set a scene during a horror movie, and it takes place at it's got the adult industry in it. And obviously it's got a killer element to it, and so I was really trying to not so much interested in the adult industry part of it. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I was really again trying to get a feel for how different authors set up horror movie kills and how those things work and how they build tension. And so this one was more less about entertainment value for me and more about the educational part that's going to help me with my writing down the line. So I do that, but I do like in general, I like reading a lot of books from unknown authors. So that was another reason why I wanted to pick this one up. Next up is a very emotional experience because I read An American Marriage by Tayari Jones. And this one is it's a tough read, a difficult subject. It has to do with issues around injustice in the legal system for Black men. It has to do with the impact that can have on relationships, including marriages, obviously, as you can see by the title. And so there's this dynamic where there are multiple parties involved in what becomes an emotional tug of war. And it's really difficult to read. There are parts of the book that are letters from the husband who's in jail to his wife, and he can kind of see how things are starting to fall apart as they exchange these letters, and you can just feel the emotion, and it's like the parts with the letters are like, it reads really fast but really powerful at the same time. And so this is definitely not an easy book to read. It's got from the New Yorker, it says powerful, both sweeping and intimate. And I think that's a good way of putting it. Here's from the New York Times book review, haunting, beautifully written. Essence magazine, Tayari Jones has emerged as one of the most important voices of her generation. From USA Today, brilliant, heartbreaking, with spare and shimmering prose that can strike with the shock of a shiv, Jones captures the life-altering losses Roy and Celestial endure in this unforgettable American marriage. And then lastly, from the Los Angeles Times, Tayari Jones is a bard of the modern South, a writer whose skill at weaving stories is matched only by her compassion for her characters. In An American Marriage, Jones has crafted a complex, layered story that's both intimate and broad, a literary page-turner that's almost impossible to put down, and all of that is true and more. Not easy to read in some ways, but very important to read in many more ways. Next up, When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole. And this is one that I had been wanting to read for a long time, and it's a kind of a spooky story, at least that's the way it's billed, and it has to do with a neighborhood that's in the midst of gentrification, a gentrification issue, and it mixes in kind of a digital era, social media type thing going on, and there's some incidents that happen during this as you get a feel for the story and the way things are changing and how these changes are impacting people in the community. And so it was a really powerful read. Maybe not as much of a creepy type of story as I was anticipating. Not that necessarily that took away from it, but it was an interesting read, and I would definitely be interested in more books by Alyssa Cole. Next up is my first Brandon Sanderson book, of course, and that's Elantris. And this is one that I was looking for a Brandon Sanderson book to break into, and I decided to pick this one up. So if you'll see in some of my weekly wrap-up video that I did highlighting this particular book, it took me a little bit of a while to read it because it's a very long book, and I don't do well with very long books. But this one was really good. It was excellent world building that really hooked me right from the start, and so that was one of the reasons that I was more than willing to endure and work through to the end, because I was excited about the world building and what was to come based on the way that Brandon Sanderson kicked this particular book off. So I'm definitely interested in reading more Brandon Sanderson books. I'm not sure if I want to either continue with maybe his series, his book series, or if I want to maybe look at some standalone. I understand, or I think I saw that he has some standalone type books that might be pretty interesting for me to work my way into Brandon Sanderson and to build up my endurance for longer books, which sometimes I kind of shy away from. So I need to work my way up to being able or being comfortable reading longer books. So, but Elantris by Brandon Sanderson was really good. I enjoyed it. It was grabbing right off the bat. The characters were pretty richly drawn, and again, the world building was superb. So, definitely would recommend Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. And lastly, to finish off the month of February, is a book that I grabbed from my collection in the garage, from the stacks of books in my garage that were rescued, and there's still some that need to be rescued. We'll get to that this summer. Color of Justice, a novel of suspense by Gary Hardwick. And I've since realized that Gary Hardwick has more books. Gary Hardwick is a Detroit native and is the author of other novels. He apparently, at least according to this book, when this book came out, which I think was 2003 or 2004, 2002. I was wrong, but I was in the neighborhood. Color of Justice follows a Detroit detective, Danny Kavanaugh, and he is a white guy who has grown up in black culture in Detroit, and so that makes for an interesting character dynamic with him as he works to solve these crimes that are taking place within the city. And so one of the things that was interesting about this, and he tries to, obviously tying it all together, but one of the things that was really interesting about this story is, for me, is because being a Detroit native, I recognize so many of the places that they're talking about, and I can picture it a little bit more in my head, so it made it a little bit more vivid for me. And every once in a while I do look for books that are set in Detroit for that very reason. There are obviously subplots that are going on throughout the book that make it kind of interesting. It dragged a little bit in some spots. It maybe could have been a little bit shorter. I know people are going to be like, okay, you say that a lot. And yeah, I do. But yeah, it was one that I couldn't put down. I really enjoyed reading it. So there are other books, there are other Danny Kavanaugh books, and I've been exploring those, and I'm tempted to pick those up because, again, Danny Kavanaugh, it was an interesting character with the way that he, being white and yet, being so embedded in the black culture of Detroit, just again made for just a really, really interesting character drawn there. So for that reason alone, when I get an interesting character, I'm a very character-driven reader, and I'm a character-driven writer. And if you put a good character even in a mediocre story, not saying that's what this is, but if you put a good character in a mediocre story, I'm really interested in that character if the story is at least decent. So this was a decent story. It was a solid story with a very interesting set of characters, including Danny Kavanaugh. So definitely one that I enjoyed reading. If you're a person from Detroit, you probably would like reading this book. Even if you're not, though, you might find it pretty interesting as they unravel the mystery that leads to the climax. Okay, so there you have it, my 7 books read for the month of February 2021. A very productive month of reading. It didn't start off, well, it started off as planned. It did not finish as planned because there are always different books that come up that make you go in different directions. And so that was again the case in the month of February. But at the end of the day, at the end of the month, it was a productive month of reading. I'm excited about it. I hope you are too. I hope you are even more excited about the books that you have hopefully been reading this month. And I hope, like me, you're looking forward to the books that you're going to read in the month of March.